Welcome, everybody. Welcome to those of you who are online this week. Welcome to week 8 of our Equip series. So we've got one more left next week. We're very excited this week to have Michael Maibach. We got a chance to know him a little bit better last night. We had a nice dinner, and he's gotten a really impressive resume. I wish I'd asked you all about it last night. But just a couple of high points about Michael. He's a native of Illinois. Very importantly, he's a Cubs fan, which is
It's in the state constitution.
So near and dear to my heart already. And he spent 7 years after college in government affairs at Caterpillar. Then he was vice president for global government affairs for 18 years at Intel. And for 10 years, he was the president the European American Business Council. And among many other things that he does, and he'll tell you about some of those, today he's a distinguished fellow at Save Our States, defending the Electoral College, which is very much under attack right now, if you haven't noticed that discussion. But he's got a number of fields of expertise, I think, a number of issues he talks on. But when he told me about he speaks about the virtues of a commercial republic, which is what he's going to be talking about today. I thought that's one that I think is really, really important because you all are in college or just graduated college or some online or at different places, but I think this is just a critical issue that we need to be talking about more today. It's such at the heart of liberty, and we need to understand why, that commercial societies, free markets are actually virtuous. So I'll let you take it away. I think we sent around this to everyone, so maybe you got a little bit of a preview. Encourage you to be interactive today. Mr. Maibach has a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience. I'm looking forward to it. So,
Thanks very much. Yeah, appreciate it. Nice of you to take the time to be with me.
and let me just mention, so anyone online who'd like to ask a question, there's a question function on there, and you could send that to Catherine. I think Catherine's chatting with a few of you, so if you have a good question, certainly ask it. We'll try to get to it.
Very good. Okay. Thank you. Good to be with you this morning. If you take away no other message from this presentation, I think the key takeaway is that to have generosity in a society, you have to have limited government. There has to be room for generosity. So this is not just about business. This is about human flourishing, this presentation, and what it takes to have a flourishing society. And I'll go through those thoughts with you, but if you had to leave right now, I would hope you'd take away the thought that the bigger the government gets, the less generous people can afford to be. And if you look across Europe, there's how many members of the European Union? How many countries? 28, soon to be 27, because who's leaving? The British are leaving. Of those countries, none are replacing their population. In other words, their population growth is 1.9 or lower. It takes 2.1. We're barely replacing our population. Italy is a 1.3, which means someday there won't be any Italians, and all the good shoes will be gone. So the point is, societies that have so much government, that take so much away from families and from husbands and wives, they don't have children because they can't, either they have no faith in the future or they can't afford it, right? We're at the family foundation. And by the way, who knows the levels of government? Who's a student of government here? I'm trying to remember who you are, right? Yeah. Prue, Mr. Prue.
Yes. In America, it's we have the legislative branch, the executive.
No, the levels of government. So you have federal, you have state, and you have local. Is that it?
A lot of people say family.
Oh, perfect answer. The family is the first level of government. Matter of fact, when I see people throw rocks through windows, the first thing I think of is my father would be so ashamed if I did that. But if you don't have a father that teaches you that, you're really in trouble. So when the first level of government fails, all the other levels of government are strained, because all those things that you didn't learn in the family become prisons, drug addiction, divorce, broken families, crime, etc. So what you're doing here at the Family Foundation, it's really a great name because it's not only a foundation in terms of a nonprofit, but the family is the foundation of our society, right? Matter of fact, Marx and Engels, especially Engels, did not like marriage and did not like the family. They thought that's where everybody learns the wrong things. We'll get them into the schools and we'll change them. Okay, so let's go through some thoughts here. Now we have this phrase, order, liberty. You know Russell Kirk? That's another author you want to read. I knew Russell Kirk before he passed away, and his wife Annette, who I still know these days, wonderful human being. You want to read Russell Kirk. Anything he's written, right? You want to read him. He used the word order, liberty. So if you're a parent, you want what in your household? Order. If you're a child, what do you want? Liberty, right? And what you learn in the family is order, liberty, which is, okay, we're going to go out and play now, but now we have to come back in and study, right? And that kind of discipline, you know, if you think about it, most creatures of the world, they have a new bird or a new dog or a new cat, and very quickly they learn how to be a bird but it takes us 18 years to learn how to be a person because we're so complicated, but also because we have to learn prudence. Okay, so let's go through some ideas here if I can get this started. Okay, so most commercials, but not most careers, but not yours, your commercial careers. Most people work in business, so we ought to understand some of the values and their role in our republic, right? So freedom is a rare bird across history, or liberty, right? Most people, for most of human existence, lived in a cage. We're going to talk about the second virtue, which is wealth creation. So first liberty, then wealth creation. Why do you care about money? Because it makes all the important things possible. I used to work for one of the founders of Intel. I worked for all four founders of the Intel Corporation. One of them, Andy Grove, who escaped from Hungary in 1956, became our CEO when I was there, said to me, because I was their voice in Washington, go tell the politicians they have to do X so that our company will flourish and all these companies will flourish, so that people will be able to afford to do the important things. So even as the CEO of a big company, he realized that there are more important things, but wealth creation is about important things. And third, we want to have a commercial society that's full of virtue. And these are the things that we'll list as virtues here. And of these virtues, the most important one is not on here. And what is that? Starts with a C. Courage. Because you have to have courage to practice the other virtues. So this is the first virtue, courage. Okay, so we want to talk about freedom. We want to talk about wealth creation, virtues, in order to get to this society, which is what the business you're in here, right? Faith, family, and fraternity, the 3 F's. Don't see any business there, but business makes it financially possible and creates the virtues. So let's talk about freedom, order, liberty. Pretty rough world out there. Matter of fact, all these people that are rioting because this is such an unjust society haven't traveled. If they would travel, they would know how fortunate we are. Just spend a week in Cuba or North Korea or Iran or Russia or China, right? China, 1.3 billion people, and if you're not in the party over there, you have no political power at all. So these are all infamous people that rule other people with an iron fist. Very violent, lots of killers. What I don't have is Karl Marx, who is probably the most harmful person ever to have lived, because so many millions of people have been enslaved by the communist ideas. We still have the Castro family since 1959 running Cuba. Right? Remember when George Washington, after 2 terms in office, relinquished, well, actually, when George Washington won the Revolutionary War in 1783, and then went back to his plantation in Mount Vernon, what did King George III say about George Washington? He said, if he really does that, he'll be the greatest man in history. And what he meant by that was the following. The whole history of the world was, once you're the conquering general, you then take over the country. This is Napoleon, right? And Washington wins the war and then says, I'm going back to my farm now. So we have a wonderful founder who wasn't power hungry, right? He goes back to his farm. Well, these people never go back to their farm, right? Mao won in 1949 a revolution, a civil war, right after the Second World War against Chiang Kai-shek, who then went to Taiwan. That's why Taiwan is free, because all the freedom-loving people went over there. And 70 years later, we have Xi, who's now declared he's prime minister, well, premier for life. Right? This is what most of the world has experienced for most of human history. This is Venezuela today. It's not in the news right now, but it's a complete tragedy. At one point, it was the 5th richest country in Latin America. And now it's a basket case. This is their grocery store, right? Shortages, failures, people trying to leave, etc. But we, democratic republics, have problems. Mrs. May resigned last May after failed prime ministership, and we've had 3 British prime ministers. This is the current one, who's got all kinds of challenges, Brexit, etc. It's got Hong Kong, which is now being taken over by the Chinese, breaking their word, etc. This is from last year. Italian's government collapses, turning chaos into crisis. This is Argentina, where Argentina election surprise triggers historic stock market and currency crash. So what I'm trying to explain to you, and then this is us right now. This is the summer of 2020. You're living through a historic year. It might even get worse, right? We'll see. But by gosh, it's the most unusual year I've ever experienced. My point is, self-government is really, really hard. And we take it for granted. But most of the world, for most of history, couldn't figure it out until our founders figured out how to do that. So let's talk about the founders here. Al will love this. They studied history, right? They knew what Cicero said. If you don't know history, you will always be a child. I'll bet you 80 to 90% of the people that are knocking down statues in this country today have no idea who the person is that they're pulling down. Have never read a thing about them. They know one sentence, which is, that's a statue, our forefathers built it, and everything our fathers built, I have to tear down. That's as far as they go. That's their ideology. Because they're children. When you see them on the streets, I don't care how big and strong and old they are, these are children because they're tearing down things they know nothing about, by and large. Winston Churchill said, the further you can see backward, the further you can see forward. Now, why is that true? Who knows why it's true that we can benefit at all from looking at the past? Al, you're a history major. Why is it important to know the past?
What I would say is that not necessarily that history repeats itself, but I think that history definitely rhymes with itself, and you can definitely see very clear parallels to certain things that happened in the past.
Because human nature does not change. Who believes that human nature never changes across history? Raise your hand. You are all classical conservatives. Because the progressive mind thinks there's nothing to learn from the past. It's all corrupt. It's all imperfect. Now that I've arrived, I finally know what's good because I have my truth. And my truth has nothing to do with the past. And this is why they tear down the statues, because they think they can't learn anything from it. Right? But we have the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. to remind us how stupid a war that was, how futile that was. So put a monument to the people that died, 60,000 Americans died, because we want to learn from that. Do you learn from your mistakes or your successes in life? Yes. So sometimes you want to put on the agenda your problems. So does this look like Washington, D.C., sort of? They built our monuments to model after the Romans. Publius, what is Publius? Who knows who Publius was? Publius, Federalist Papers.
That was the
That was the pen days,
Yeah,
right?
it was the aliens.
And Publius was a Roman. Okay? And one of the anti-federalists was Cato the Elder, another Roman. So our founders were very keyed in on why the Athenians lost their city-state through poor leadership. Plato was a student of who?
Socrates.
Socrates. And after Socrates, what happened to Socrates?
He was basically.
Who's read Plato's Republic? Sorry, Plato's Apology. Who's read Plato's Apology? Okay. So I will buy you a copy of Plato's Apology. It's 40 pages. Just send me the bill. But I want you to read it. You will cry. You will weep. This is the trial of Socrates for asking questions of the youth and corrupting their minds. He was asking them about war, or what they wanted to be. So Plato starts the first university called the Academy. That's where we get the word. Right? And he starts the Academy, and one of the things he writes in his book, Plato's Republic, is tyranny naturally arises out of democracy. Because so if 2/3 of this room wants to do one thing and 1/3 wants to do the other, and so we have a vote. The tyranny of the majority, that's the phrase we get out of Tocqueville, right? Okay, very good, very good. Okay, so what he realized was you can't have a democracy, you have to have a republic, because a republic at least will have institutions to support minority rights, even one person with a religious belief that nobody else believes, right? But the tendency of every majority is to tyrannize the minority. That is the tendency. And always has been, always will be, because man's nature never changes. And we are broken. We're broken, right? Christians. Okay. Rome was a republic and it became an empire. And our founders studied that. They studied this. Our Liberty Bell. You know, only one thing is written on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and it is a quotation from the book of Leviticus. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land and to all the inheritors. the founders put an Old Testament quote. We're a Judeo-Christian regime, right? It's on our Liberty Bell. How many Americans know that the Old Testament is on the Liberty Bell? Bell, about 7. We know who they are, and we come to their house once in a while just to remind them. No, so nobody knows that. So this is John Locke. This is a very important book. After he wrote this book, he had to leave England because the king wanted him killed. He fled to the Netherlands. Because John Locke, who our founders read for sure, said there is no divine right of kings. In other words, the king is not ordained by God to be the king. Well, that was blasphemy, because these kings, one after another, would claim, I'm here because God has appointed me and my family. Right? But he said that's wrong. There's a social contract between people and their rulers. That's what we have, hopefully, between our governments still. We'll see. And because why? Because we have natural rights. Now, natural rights, before we had a constitution in this country, did we have natural rights? Yes, we did. Natural rights are sort of what you know in your gut is wrong, which is, if you have a $20 bill and you walk out of the room and I go in your purse, I know it's wrong. Even if there's no law that says stealing is wrong, I know it's wrong. Thou shalt not kill, to harm people. We just naturally know it's wrong. We're moral creatures, but we're moral creatures that have choices. But we know what's right and what's wrong. And he talked about life, liberty, and property. Jefferson turned that into life, liberty, and what was the third phrase? Okay, and what did Jefferson and the founders mean by the word happiness? No. Oh my gosh. It was to pursue a virtuous life. To be happy is not, I'm in Club Med on the beach. That's a very transient happiness. As a matter of fact, you can't eat enough potato chips, right? You can't ever be happy in that sense. But to be happy, happiness in the Declaration, what the founders meant was the freedom to pursue a virtuous life, to get aligned with what you think is right in the world, to learn and to be constructive and to add value as a good person. That's to be pursuing happiness. So, young man, what's your name?
Peter.
Peter. Upon this rock, but that's a big name. My gosh. Okay, you have a lot to live up to, Peter. So, if your mother, is this your mother right next to you? Okay, she well behaved. You have order in your family. Very good. So, Peter, if your mother says to you sometime, Peter, are you happy? What you might say is, well, you know, physically I'm a little uncomfortable, but spiritually I'm very happy. Try that out. Try that. Not right now, but try that out. She'll probably say, maybe take 2 aspirin and take a nap or something. Okay, so Locke was very important. The founders, it's 100 years before the election of George Washington. So I'd like to say, you know, people say, we shouldn't have in God we trust on our currency. To which I say, you don't know the rest of the sentence. Now, I made this up, so this is gospel, right? The rest of the sentence is, in God we trust and not the king. In other words, we get our rights from God, not the king. That's what this says. If you have anybody, some atheist that says our government should not have on our currency, in God we trust, say, I'm sorry, you probably don't understand what's meant by that. It's not a religious thing. It is we get our rights from our God and not from our government. Now, I've been to 67 countries. I have never been to a country where citizens have said to me, we get our rights from God. They say we get our rights from the parliament, from the Congress, from the Politburo, whatever it is, right? We get our rights from government. But we are an exceptional nation. We talk about American exceptionalism for one reason. If anybody says, why are we an exceptional nation? It's not that we're bigger, richer, stronger, any of that stuff. It's because our founders, and we believe we get our rights from our Creator. That's exceptional, right? And that means that everybody has rights. So democracy, they don't see it that way. The majority rules. But in a republic, everybody has rights because everybody is given those rights from our Creator. And that's where we get our rights to govern at all. And we have to respect those rights. So 1776 was a big time year. There were two revolutions. Two things were written in 1776. What were those things? America, what was written in 1776?
Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence, very good. And what else was written in Scotland at the same year? By the way, La-di-da, this is Mr. La-di-da, George III, the guy that we defeated, right? And when George Washington was sworn in April of 1789 in New York City to the presidency, people asked him, what shall we call you? Your Highness, Your Excellency, what's your title? And he said, how about Mr. President? Right? I'm just one of you. I'm not, this is what we got rid of
You don't hear that anymore either.
by these men here.
Mr.
And that's
President,
Jefferson reporting to John Adams, who chaired the committee. The Declaration was written by a committee and John Adams chaired it. But Jefferson was such a good writer. He was only 33 years old, which, by the way, was the last year of Christ's life. You know, what is it about when you're 33, you do all kinds of things? I don't know. But it's interesting. He was 33 and they said, Jefferson's the best writer we have. And he was very well read. And he knew his Locke. Matter of fact, Jefferson Monticello has 3 portraits on his wall. Anybody know what those are? Okay. Well, one is Newton because of physics, and one was Locke because of this. Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776. He was a moral philosopher. At a time of mercantilism, when nations were involved with zero sum thinking. Can we turn the air conditioning just a little bit less cold? Probably won't survive the speech if it gets any colder. Just a couple of degrees or so, whatever. Thank you, sir. Okay. Because Adam Smith was all about free markets and free men, right? And whenever you say the word man, it's all men, all women. So here's the Declaration of Independence. This is a wonderful, by the way, that's on our money, right?
right.
That's the Creator's eye. That's why it's on the money.
On the money.
So assume among the, this is from the Declaration, assume among the powers of earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them. Behold these truths. You know all these things. But look at the word Creator, divine providence. And Jefferson was no Christian, no normal Christian. You know, the Jefferson Bible is a Bible. He took all of the miracles out of the Bible because he didn't believe that they were miracles. He didn't believe in them. So he was a sort of a deist. He was, but he did believe that we had a creator, and that's where we got our rights because Locke convinced him of that. So this fellow, Montesquieu, is this Frenchman, and for 20 years, he studied the question of self-government. Because in 1748, when he wrote his book, Spirits of the Law, they had a king, right? He says, every regime is constructed around the social class. Aristocracy around kings, queens, czars, all that. It's what you have in China, what you have in Russia, pretty much. Military leaders, like Egypt, they took over the government. We've had that in lots of countries in the world. Clergy, and farmers, manufacturers, and traders, like the US, Canada, Australia, Austria, et cetera, et cetera. So which of those regimes do you want to live in? That's what he's asking. So he wrote this book, The Spirit of the Laws, when our founders were very young men. And therefore, this would have been a book they read. They knew their Montesquieu. And he came up with this, well, he got it from Probius, who was a Roman. So sort of secondhand, he got it from the Roman Republic. But look at John Adams. He wrote, it is the form of government which gives the decisive color to the manners of the people. In other words, how you are governed actually affects how people live. So he read his Montesquieu. He said, monarchies beget subjects. Everybody in China is pretty much a subject. Theocracies beget believers and non-believers, right? And unfortunately, there's no Muslim majority country that is a democracy, as a democratic republic. Because in that religion, there are only believers and not believers. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there are believers and potential believers. It's a very different way to look at things. Oligarchies, the powerful and the powerless. Republics beget citizens, that's what you are. But commercial republics, that's our topic today, industrious citizens. So which of those regimes do you want to live in? Probably a commercial republic. Now, what the United States did, our founders did, was turn the world upside down. In the whole world until, we have the world's first constitution. Well, actually, Massachusetts has the world's first constitution. It's the oldest constitution. But our constitution is the oldest national constitution. It's the first, right? The Italian constitution today is 100 years old. Okay, so we're 140 years older than the Italian constitution, for example. The Europeans and really the whole world was living like this. Power was unlimited in government, and what they did was limit government. Matter of fact, in Federalist 84, Hamilton says, some people say the constitutions have a Bill of Rights, and what he says in Federalist 84 is the entire Constitution is a Bill of Rights. All the checks and balances and the limits of power, this is how you get your rights guarded. So the separation of powers to protect the minority from the majority by way of checks and balances. So why do we have a House and Senate right down the street here? Because if the passions of one of the bodies is going to be tyrannical, the other will cool it. I think it was Adams that said, the Senate is the saucer and the House is the cup. And the saucer is supposed to cool the cup, right? So and then we have the veto, because we want a governor or a president to guard the minority if both House and Senate become tyrannical. And we have a Supreme Court to overrule all of them if they take away our rights that are found in the Constitution. There's lots of protections against majority tyranny. The number one goal of the founders was not majority rule. Absolutely not. It was to guard against majority tyranny. That was their goal. So Madison says, an elective despotism was not the government. In other words, we got rid of the king, now we're going to elect people to become despots. No, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for, but one founded on free principles in which the powers of government should be so divided and balanced that no one could transcend their legal limits without being checked by the others. Okay, so we want order and liberty. This is how you get it, the checks and balances. Republics are designed to guard against tyranny, especially tyranny of the majority. And so, but we weren't going to get the Constitution enacted by the people of New York in convention, because we had 13 ratifying conventions. And so quietly, Madison promised Hamilton, who promised Lincoln Smith, that we would have a Bill of Rights, because a lot of these state constitutions had Bill of Rights. George Mason, from down here in Virginia, was against the Constitution. He had been a delegate in Philadelphia, because it did not have a Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists in part were concerned there was no Bill of Rights. Others just didn't want to have a new king. They thought the president would become a king. But here's our money right here. Our founders, and by the way, these are the 13 states here. This is the founding. This is the creator. This saying means God favors our undertaking. All right? And this saying, Novus or a new order of the ages. Our founders, this is the American seal, knew that we were overthrowing the old world of total power within government. And everybody was controlled by elites. Neither the king nor government endows man with his rights. All right. So that's getting to freedom, right? Now we want to get to wealth creation. Now, if you were a king or queen, you'd want all these virtues in your subjects. But how do you make them do this? The king and queen can't just have a declaration. Everyone now will work in teams and be disciplined. It's just not how the world works. Now, in Europe at the time of our founding, wealth was based on what?
Land.
Land. Very good. And so if I have 10 acres, and what's your name, sir?
Mark.
Mark. And Mark has no acres. What has to happen for you to get acres?
Take it.
Yeah. So you get a sword and you take a few acres from me, right? This is zero-sum life, which is in the land of landed aristocracy. Somebody has to lose for somebody to win. It's a beggar your neighbor kind of stuff. This is a terrible way of life. And most of the world under tyrants lived this way. This is one of the reasons why they had so many wars about land. Because land was where you got the food from animals, from crops, et cetera, et cetera. We hear a lot about socialism these days. Doesn't work anywhere, but it seems to be quite the vogue. I guess our universities have done their work, right? But what capitalism is about is this. The word caput is Latin for the head. Capitalism is about wealth from ideas. Now, when I was at Intel, I got to know Bill Gates at Microsoft because they were a major partner of ours. He became, at one point, the world's richest man. Is that because he had a lot of land? Did he steal his money from somebody else? No. He created software, which is really just a design put on paper, right? So wealth is created in the new world from the head. So people say you're for capitalism. Yes, because I want to have wealth created from mines. And I want to have it be additive, not zero sum. In other words, if wealth is based on land, you have to lose for me to gain. But everybody has a brain here, and if you or Peter someday start a company and it's a better idea and you create wealth, everybody's better off and nobody loses. So say, yeah, I like capitalism because what that means is from the Latin is wealth is created from my head and nobody loses, everybody gains when everybody does that. We talk about capitalism like it's the dollars, but this is what capitalism is. How many of our leaders know that this is a Latin word for head? 0.0. So what are companies for? Serving each other, right? Here's Montesquieu. When a democracy is founded on commerce, private people may acquire vast riches without a corruption of morals. This is because the spirit of commerce is naturally attended with that of frugality, economy, moderation, labor, prudence, tranquility, order, and the rule of law. Do those sound like virtues to you? Yeah, okay. So commerce is sort of organized virtue. We're going to talk a little bit about that. When you walk into a store, what do they say? What do they say?
Usually say welcome.
And may I help you? When you walk into a government agency, do they say, oh, welcome, may I help you? Take a number and get in line. It's a different spirit. Nothing wrong with government service, but that's not where wealth is created. That's where wealth is transferred to other people, right? The wealth is created by private people working together. If all of us in this room formed a company to serve others, that's where wealth is created. Not from the legislature saying, we're going to give this amount to this group and this amount to that group. May I help you? Now, I went to grade school, high school, and college with this guy, Mike Coyle. His father worked at Caterpillar. He was in sales. And Mike was a mediocre, we were in the same fraternity, and I know he was a mediocre student. I was a much more successful student than he was. He hated school, really. But he got a finance degree, and he moved to Rockford, Illinois with his girlfriend, who he married, Linny. And he started, just him, Mike Coyle's insurance agency. And now he's retired, but this is his company, and these are some of the employees of his company. So one guy goes to college at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, Illinois. Doesn't know exactly what he's going to do, but he has to make a living. He starts his own company. And he created all these jobs. And all of them have spouses and children, etc. And they are generous. They give to their churches, their synagogues, whatever, to charities, etc. But one person started a company. That's where wealth is created, right? That's where wealth is created. So here's Tocqueville. I love this guy. Isn't he a handsome guy? I love this. All right. The doctrine of self-interest, properly understood, does not inspire great sacrifices, but every day it prompts some small ones. You know, when a parent says, now, thank your aunt, thank you. That's right. It's manners, but it's commercial manners, right? By itself, it cannot make a man virtuous, but its discipline shapes orderly, temperate, moderate, careful, and self-controlled citizens. If it does not lead the will directly to virtue, it establishes habits which unconsciously turn it that way. So you get hired by a bagel shop, and you're 16 years old, and you're a high school student, and they say, look, when the customers come in, you say, welcome, may I help you? What do you need? And you get it. And if you're out of that, you say, I'm so sorry, but we do have these other ones that have raisins instead of, you know, peanuts on them or something. Maybe I can get you that, etc. So that's building virtue just by serving others and forgetting about yourself. Virtue begins sort of with selflessness, humility. All good things begin with humility, right? A good marriage, being a good parent, being a good brother or sister, being a good teacher, humility, right? Here's a Pope Pius XII, one of the greats. Every exchange of products, quite apart from satisfying definite needs, puts new means into operation, arouses unexpected energies, and stimulates the spirit of enterprise and invention. 1956, he said that to, in effect, the Chamber of Commerce of Italy. So, in conclusion, this is the old world of zero sum, landed aristocracy. This is the new world, Adam Smith and the founders, which is win-win versus zero sum. You can have a good idea without taking one from someone else, and good ideas have a multiplier effect, right? Look at these two guys here, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford. Invented the phonograph, the light bulb, the vacuum tube, the beginning of the telephone, etc. And of course, Henry Ford, mass production of automobiles, so everybody could have a car versus only the wealthy. Alexander Hamilton, on his famous report of manufacturers, if you're a history major, you want to read this. It's a very important document. He was Secretary of the Treasury at the time. In a nation in which enterprise multiplies the fields of activity, the tyranny of the majority is less likely. In other words, the more you have dispersion of wealth in companies and competition, sort of an argument for antitrust, the more competition you have, the less you'll have a tyranny majority. Do you want to have one airline or four? Do you want to have six gyms in town, gymnasiums to join, or do you just want to have one health club? Do you like it or not? Because one of the problems with government is you got one post office, right? And until UPS and FedEx came along, there was no overnight mail for anybody, all right? Other than government couriers or something. But as soon as UPS and FedEx started doing overnight, guess what the government did, the post office? They started doing the same thing. Competition leads to freedom, right? So there have been four economic ages, the agricultural age, the machine age, the digital age, and the information age. And we're going to end up with some thoughts about those things. The agricultural age, tame nature to feed us all. This is when men started living in towns rather than roaming. All right, this was centuries ago, long before we have recorded history. But that caused those farms eventually to need mechanization. And I worked for 7 years for Caterpillar. This guy had 8th grade education, Ben Holt, but he loved to tinker. He was a born engineer. And he saw in California that in the winter, you know, they have rain in the winter, but only in the winter. But they don't have peat in the soil in California. They don't have clay, they have peat. So the soil has clay here, and when it rains, it's still very hard. But in California, out in the farms in California, the Central Valley, they have peat, and therefore when it rains, the farm vehicles, which were these big wheeled devices, would sink, and therefore guys like him who were making those vehicles got no sales because their customer in the winter, because the customers couldn't use these heavy tractors, they sunk. But he had this idea, and others did as well. The train went past his home in Stockton, California, into San Francisco, and he said to himself, why is the train not sinking like my agricultural equipment is sinking? It has tracks. So the train gave him the idea to put tracks on his farm implements, which is why we call it a tractor today, right? And in 1904, he comes up with this. Other people tried it, but he was the first one to make one work. And he had a press conference in Stockton out in a field in 1904, and a writer wrote, he said, this tractor looks like a caterpillar rolling over the ground, and he said, I'm going to call it the Holt Caterpillar, and that's where Caterpillar gets its name, from a reporter reporting on what this vehicle looks like, right? But so my point is, one man with an 8th grade education created a company today that's what, $50 billion company with 80 or 90,000 employees. That's where wealth is created. One person capital, right? No government involved at all other than protecting his intellectual property with patents, that sort of thing. So the machine age, Henry Ford here in single sewing machine, replicated man's arms and legs. So first we're using animals, and then we start with machines replicating our arms and legs, right? Like a locomotive. Or this replicates our legs by getting us from A to B without walking ourselves and without having to feed the animals, et cetera, et cetera. So from farm to factory. And the biggest revolution we've had in the world, other than the Christian Revolution, had been the machine age until the information age, which we'll close with, where virtually the whole population over about 70 years goes from the farm to the factory, which begins unions, which begins unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, all kinds of legislative policies. But it all starts in 1775 with this British man, James Watt, who invented the steam engine. This is a huge thing. There's the wheel, there's fire, the steam engine, right? This is very important because if he could burn coal, he was British, so he's burning coal, lots of coal in those days, or wood, or anything, burn anything here. The pressure from that, the steam, powers things, and all of a sudden they have steam engines inside factories powering powering all kinds of manufacturing, production operations, right? And from this, we get his company, the James Watt Company, like John Deere, right? James Watt, Ben Holt. So this is his, so he's selling these engines then to produce power, which then allows for electricity. But look at this graph. This is population and standard of living from 8,000 BC, 8,000 BC until the steam engine. That's the GDP growth of the world, which is there were very few rich and they were doing fine, and everybody else did the same thing. Their father, their grandfather, their great, which is barely make through. And by the way, people lived to be about 35, 40 years old, right? And then along comes the steam engine. And this is world population growth and standard of living ever since the machine age, right? And of course, with the information age, it just keeps going up. So the richer and richer we are, the more and more some people are out in the streets saying how unfair life is. If they had just lived back here in 2000 BC, they could riot all they want until the king kills them. All right, there are no constitutions, no rights, just mow them down. Right? So it's the Communist Manifesto, 1848, the most important evil thing ever written is this book by these two men. The bourgeoisie, talking about capitalists, during its rule of scarce 100 years, so this is from 1748, the beginning of the industrial age, then the steam engine comes along, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all preceding generations together. What we just saw. This is Marx. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, and applications of chemistry, to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. The machine age brought all this. Europe during the machine age went from 2 to 400 million people. They doubled the population in 100 years because of the wealth they created. What earlier century had even a precedent that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? This is a tribute to what capitalism has done. And then what he says is, now that they've built this up, we the workers have to take it over and make sure that everybody will be equal in this society. The great, Tocqueville said, if Americans have to choose between equality and freedom, we'll choose equality. Which we talk about today as social justice, that's equality, which is the government and I will force you to be equal with everybody else, which is there'll be a few wealthy people, the oligarchy, and everybody else and all the wealth creation will be subjected to that. Michael Novak, who was a friend of mine, wonderful human being, passed away about 5 years ago, wrote this book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. If you want to read a good book about capitalism and human flourishing, this is the book for you. So you're getting, I think, some good books here, including Russell Kirk and Michael Novak, two people that I have the great honor to know. And what Novak said was political democracy is compatible in practice only with market economies. In other words, you want to be free, you got to have capitalism, market economy. Both systems nourish and are best nourished by a pluralistic liberal culture, and by liberal he meant a positive attitude toward dissent and different ideas. Right? Saying what we call the loyal opposition, we used to call in this country. Now it is canceled. Right? I mean, the House of Representatives will not pass anything for the president to sign because they dislike him so much. There is no comity anymore. Most of my life, our government was not like that. Democrats and Republicans worked together. We don't do that anymore. We are divided. Order liberty requires Republican institutions, Republican, not Democratic. In other words, protection for minority rights, market economy, and a culture. Comes from the word cult. A culture that we would say has a Christian bent toward other people. In other words, we think the best of others, and when we disagree and we respect them, as opposed to we want to cancel them or call them a racist or something like that. Novak continues, of all the systems of political economy across history, none has so revolutionized human life, lengthened the lifespan, made the elimination of poverty and famine thinkable, and enlarged the range of human choice. I mean, you students can go anywhere in the world and do so many things. My parents didn't go to college. I asked my father and mother lived through the Depression. When my father was 18, he graduates from high school in May of 1941, and by December, he's in the U.S. military. And 3 months later, he spent 4.5 years in the Pacific shooting shells off of a ship against Japanese ships and other targets. His college years were spent in war. Right? He came back to Peoria, Illinois, and I said to him when I was in college, I wrote him a letter because I'm a freshman, and this is what you asked your father when you're a freshman. Why did you become a banker? He became a bank president. Well, when he got back from the war, the only job he could find after the Depression and the war was he was a messenger for a bank, and he worked his way up in that bank. He said, I never wanted to, he wrote me back, I never wanted to be a banker. It was what I could find. I wanted to be a forest ranger. I almost fell off of my dorm bed. I thought, my banker father wanted to be a forest ranger. But he came back to his hometown. He found a job. He met my mother. He met my mother in high school, married her, and they had children. And what was he going to do? Going to uproot, and nobody left their hometown. Now you guys, you're from Tennessee, but now you live here, and you move all this freedom and opportunity you have. 100 years ago, people just didn't have that. Democratic capitalism made that possible. Recall the Roman Empire, the Catholic and Protestant powers in the 17th century, colonial mercantilism. Examine the many forms of socialism in the present day. None compare to the spirit of democratic capitalism. So this is what we want to keep. This is our inheritance, not tear down. So these are the Marxist nations today. How they do? You want to live in any of those places? This is the commercial republics. This is, the redder they are, the more per capita GDP they have. So look at the Judeo-Christian world here. The British, right? And the Japanese, for different reasons. At the end of the Second World War, the Japanese turned their, we have a Defense Department. It's called the Department of War until Harry Truman. Now it's called the Defense Department. But the Department of War in Japan was the Ministry of War. At the end of the Second World War, they closed down pretty much their Ministry of War, and they turned it into MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. They turned their War Department into their commercial department because they knew with their new constitution, and they'd been completely defeated by the Allies, if they were going to be powerful in the world, they were going to be powerful as capitalists and not as warriors, if you will. And so they turned all those energies and all their teamwork. Their flag is a focus, right? They are the teamwork capital, that's for sure. So the digital age, this is where I worked after I left Ben Holt's Caterpillar. I worked for the founders. I was assistant to Robert Noyce. He invented the silicon chip. He was a founder of Intel. He and Gordon Moore, if you know Moore's law. So what this was is replicating the memory and logic of the brain. So if you think about it, the machine age replaces your arms and legs. The information age replaces or replicates your memory and your logic. So the man is gradually creating himself to be a tool. Okay, so we have to have some Q&A time. So Hernandez de Soto, who's a Peruvian, I think he's still alive. If you want to read some good books by him, The Other Path, and he has one other book, sorry. But he says all wealth is created when a small group of individuals freely assemble to find ways to serve others. So Gordon Moore, so this is Fairchild's Semiconductor in 1957. And they're making computer chips. These two guys, Noyce and Moore, who I worked for, I was his assistant for 4 years. They then, in 1968, so 11 years later, started Intel Corporation with Andy Grove and Les Fidesz, the 4 founders who I worked for. I just got an email from Gordon and from Les, the 2 people are still alive, recently. But these guys started Fairchild Semiconductor, these 8 here, and then those 2 guys started Intel. They're both still in business, but Intel now has 110,000. So these are the founders of Intel. These are the 4 guys, and those are the guys I worked for. That's the inventor of the microprocessor right there. That's Art Rock, who gave him it's supposed to be $25 million to start Intel Corporation. And this is what they do today. They have 110,000 people because those 4 people started the company. Government doesn't do that. Government doesn't start companies. So anyway, so now we have the information age and all the social media, which I don't think creates any value, just creates lots of opportunities for mischief. But there you go. So just in summary then, this is a flourishing society. 1/3 of the GDP goes to government, 2/3 to the private sector, right? These are all the commercial virtues here. Free people, collegial, creative, of service to others, practical wisdom. And their generosity, because they make a profit, goes to their church, family, fraternity, civic groups, family foundation, etc. And that when you have 1/3 government, you have this cycle. But in the age of equality, we have this false choice that Mr. Obama sometimes talked about, which is you can be all alone or we can be together through government. And that's a false choice, right? Because we want to be in community. Human flourishing is when men and women are free to have faith or not have faith, but to have a virtuous life. And government guards our rights to do that, right? To choose, make those moral choices ourselves. But when God goes away, when we forget that we get our rights from our God, but we think we get them from government, government replaces God and government becomes the ruler. Welcome to North Korea, right? And then man has to honor government, and the choices are made, the moral choices are made for man. So in Europe today, most of the GDPs are half to government, and that leads to fewer and fewer children and the decline in faith, etc. What we want is limited government so we can have this picture right here. So why don't we end there? We've got time for some questions. Questions. Oh, one last thing. So right by my house is the Best Buns Bread Company, which sells bagels. And I like to ask people at the end of the speech, these 3 people got out of El Salvador. And I was in there one day, and I speak some Spanish, so I was speaking with them. They work there. 2 are bakers, and 1 works at the counter. And I asked for their permission and the owner's permission if I could take their pictures, which they happily allowed me to do. And I like to ask audiences, like a Rotary Club, I'll say, do you suppose that these 3 immigrants who are in a public high school in Alexandria, Virginia, learn more virtue in their public high school or in the bagel shop? Who says in the high school? Who says the bagel shop? Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So that's what we want. Okay, so if there's any questions or comments, it's a lot to take in there. Sure.
So today, especially in our information age, it seems like a lot of people have completely changed their fundamental understanding of what government should be. And it's, you can see a lot of, oh, government should be like providing us this.
Yes.
And we know that's not true. Like government's there to protect, not to like provide. So how can we effectively communicate a message that government's not supposed to be in it, everything, when everyone else seems to think that's what they should be?
A great question. My reaction is I don't have a quick answer for you, and it's a really hard question. A couple of things. One is, unless and until our schools, especially K through 12, have privatized or have different leadership, this is just going to get worse. Because unfortunately, our schools in this country are unionized. Teachers union across this country, the #1 donors to one political party. And because of that, they are teaching their students to honor government rather than freedom, because they use government power to increase their pensions, to increase their pay, to improve their working conditions, et cetera, have fewer students in the classroom. You just, that's a real problem. In the universities, of course, they're Marxists, unfortunately. So not all of them, but so many Marxists teach there now. So Woodrow Wilson gave a speech in April of 1911, a year before he ran for president, in Indianapolis to a bunch of Democrats, Democrat organizations in the country. And I don't have the quote here, but what he said was he'd been president of Princeton, and then he was governor of New Jersey at the time. He said, a couple of years ago, I was in New York, and I gave a speech to a bunch of business people, and I said, my job in this era, because the progressives thought the third era was very special and things had changed so much that everything in the past was just unusable. Really. That's the progressive mind is all about, who cares about the past? Circumstances are new. And he said, it's a stunning quote. He said, I told those men, my job was to take their sons and change everything they've learned from their fathers, because the world is so different. And he was so proud of telling these fellow Democrats that his job as a president of a college was to make these kids forget everything they learned from their fathers. When you have universities and leaders like that, I think parents should refuse to send their kids to public schools if that's what they're going to teach. Say, well, I got to go. We'll homeschool. We'll go to private schools. Give us a voucher. I think every state should give vouchers. And we got to go from government schools to public education. The public should help pay for education, but they shouldn't run the schools. It's kind of like the post office versus Federal Express. Which do you want, right? You'd rather have Federal Express. But it's a real problem. So you have to tell stories like this. I don't know. We have to have news reporters that ask these questions. They don't. Part of one party. What happened was, until the 1960s, we had two parties. The Republican Party was started in what year?
1852 or 54.
1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin. And why was it started?
As an abolitionist party.
Because what happened? What passed the Congress?
Big Kansas, Nebraska Act.
Very good. Kansas, Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas. Because Stephen Douglas wanted to be president by appealing to the North and the South, because he was for the idea of popular sovereignty, which is as we add more states, because we were adding more states, let each state population choose if they want to have slaves. Take a vote. And that's what we call bloody Kansas, because there were battles, physical battles. People were getting killed, fighting over whether or not Kansas was going to be free labor or slave. Because remember, slavery meant that the free people who were working had to compete with people that were working for nothing, right? So not only is slavery wrong, but the people have to compete against slaves. Like, you know, you've seen this week the slaves in China. Have you seen the trainloads of Uyghurs in China being taken off to factories? And, you know, there's millions of people in China that are slaves, pretty much. We still have slavery. We had slavery for the history of the world. So the Republican Party was started to be a party of abolition, of free people, free labor, free people, no more slavery, no more expansion. And that's when Lincoln became their second presidential nominee. 1856, I think it was John C. Fremont was their first. He didn't win, but the Republican Party begins with abolition, with free people, right? The Democratic Party has different roots, but it eventually became, the Republican Party was the party of business, of Main Street, they call it. And the Democratic Party was the party of the working man. So this is sort of management labor tensions, you know, labor unions and strikes versus management and capital, etc. And that was for a long time the tension. And government was the referee. But in the 60s, the Democratic Party became the party of government, the party of power rather than empowerment, if you will. And when that happened, we now have a party who has as its mission to grow government and its control over your life and to make you more and more dependent and control your thinking. So now we have this classical burden of the Republican Party being the party of free people and free markets against a party of government that wants to regulate that. And it's an elite party. It's an elite party. And that's what we're up against. We have people 24/7 teaching now against all the things I've talked about. And all this history to them is just so much fluff, not important. What's important to them is power. So Ronald Reagan in his farewell address said, we are always only one generation away from losing our freedom. And that's where we are right now. I think for the first time in my life is whether or not your children will have a constitution, the one we have. I don't know. So I think the answer to my question is, better get busy working on this. And it's going to take a lot of people, talking to a lot of people, running for office, standing up. Lincoln was this, well, he became a wealthy lawyer as a railroad lawyer, became a wealthy guy, relatively speaking. But he had run for the Senate and lost. He had run for re-election in the U.S. House and he had lost. He had run for re-election in the state legislature and lost. He had mostly losses in his life. But then he runs for president. He gives these speeches, the Cooper Union speech, really that and a couple of other speeches he gave, put him on the map. They nominated him and he saved the country. 700,000 people died before he saved the country. So buckle up. You're heading into very difficult waters. Sorry. But, yes, ma'am.
Did you say anything to be said a little bit about, they hear the messages that we're getting all the time now on the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting
Yeah,
poorer,
right.
crony capitalism.
Yes.
Can you speak to maybe where there is a little trouble with crony capitalism and where that claim goes overboard?
Well, crony capitalism is where government puts their thumb on the scale for certain industries. And that happens. But I'm no expert on that topic, but I think the bigger issue is the rich and poor thing. We are getting a bigger division between rich and poor because two things are happening. One is we are getting richer, and I mean a lot richer, although that trade may stall out here if what happened here in this state capital with an all blue becomes Washington, D.C. Wait for taxation and regulation to drop us down to 1% GDP growth for the next 4 years and to see how much people like that. But what I like to say to people, I like to put these things in practical terms. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, 170,000 people. About 65% of the K through 12 students are in private school. 65%, which means 65% of the parents are paying their taxes for the grade schools and the high school. We only have one high school, by the way, which tells you something. We have a monopoly high school in Alexandria. With 170,000 people, they got one high school. I grew up in a town of 100,000 people. We had 8 high schools. Okay. So, but 2 of those were Catholic, so we had 6 public high schools. But the monopoly high school gives you an idea of the mindset, right? If you have one high school, control what they learn. Control. The Democratic Party is all about controlling education. So, at least partially, that's their ideology. They're paying for the public schools and they're paying again for private schools. And so guess what happens? The poor do get poorer in the public schools and the rich do get richer because they're in the private schools with the other rich kids. And if I was running for office, what I'd say is give all those people a voucher, close all those public schools, and let those nice people whose kids are in the public schools who can't afford to be in la-di-da schools, give them a voucher so they can choose that school too. If you want to have more income equality, you have to have more education equality, right? And we're not going to do that when we have this soft bigotry of public education, which allows the wealthy to go to these schools while they keep these schools unionized and dysfunctional. That's why I really want to be on the internet. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I actually wanted to, I guess it probably kind of leads into the same question about crony capitalism, but specifically, like when we were talking about like history kind of repeating itself, right?
Yeah. Well, human nature repeats itself. Circumstances are different, but
right.
People have the same sort of strengths and weaknesses.
Right. So I look at China today, and I see a lot of parallels between Nazi Germany. You've got the humanitarian issue going on with the Uyghur Muslims. I feel it's very analogous to the Holocaust. I think that Hong Kong is very analogous to the Sudetenland. And I think that Taiwan in the very near future will be very analogous to
the Czech Republic.
Oh, well, yeah, we're
Czechoslovakia.
Right. I always thought more like Poland because I felt like that was going to be like.
Poland's a better example.
But I also see at that time many companies, many American companies, willingly and knowingly were doing business with the Nazi regime at that time. And I see the exact same thing happening today with American companies going on.
Well, the Nazi regime, there weren't too many global companies. Now it is a pandemic, if you will. So Nazi stands for National Socialism. That's the word.
Well, I'm just more like.
But my point is, this was totalitarian mindset, and all the production was for the glorification and power of the state, right? And that's what you have in China now. I was involved, biggest mistake, the only policy mistake I think I made in my 30-some years doing advocacy was getting China into the WTO. I was in debates on radio and other forums and testified before Congress on this. What I said was, Taiwan, when it first broke off from China in 1949, was a totalitarian, one-party, non-capitalistic society. It evolved into a free government. They have elections. They have branches of government. They're a republic, the Republic of Taiwan. That's what it's called. And they have free people. I've been there many times. They have free people, and they have freedom of speech, and they've evolved into a democratic capitalism, right? And I said to members of Congress and others that were skeptical, I said, if we can if China will open up to competition in markets, they will gradually become more free society. Their people will be more wealthy, they'll demand more freedoms, et cetera, et cetera. And I really believe that. And that has not been the case. And everybody across the parties now, just about everybody in Washington now agrees that China took advantage of the free trade world to create what is a completely powerful regime and will be a major rival to Japan, the United States, the West, if you will. And right in the middle of that, our country is so divided that it's a big question whether or not we can sustain this republic. And if not, we'll have 200 years of the thugs in Beijing. That's stark terms, but they are not going to change. They have no history. We owe, I believe, our free society to this fellow Jesus of Nazareth, who said everybody is equal in the eyes of God. That's natural rights. That's what he was preaching. And the West bought that people have value, that they have a soul. And therefore, Western democracy, slowly, led by this country, was built on the idea that we all have dignity. We aren't just animals to be herded and controlled. But there was no such revolution. That was a Western revolution. The Chinese have no such faith and no such revolution. And so for them, their kingdom is of this world. There is no second. And power is everything. That's what they worship. Remember the chart where I had where, this is China. And they're so powerful, 1.3 billion people. The only hope we probably have is that the Chinese people themselves will at some point revolt against this tyranny, but they're ruthless. If you're a critic, you just go to jail. Maybe your family will as well, or you disappear. So world history is full of tragedy and the dark ages, if you will, and we shouldn't assume, as all these folks in the street do, that things will always get better. Things can get much worse. Matter of fact, this country is about as good as it's ever been on the planet. So you know all that. That's what you have to defend. And your young people are going to have to, Peter, you got to defend it, buddy. So glad you're here. Are these your sisters? Okay. Thanks for bringing your kids. And you're high school students?
16.
What?
I'm 16. I'm 12.
Oh, okay. All right. So 12 would be 8th grade? 7th? And
Going into 11th.
11th. And were you homeschooled? Okay, that's one of the answers. You know, it's homeschooling, because that way you can control what they read as opposed to, yes, ma'am.
Former public school teacher.
Is that right?
I was listening to it. Everything you're saying is right.
Yeah.
The NEA, we're going to control that. We're going to get that governor out. Everything you said.
Yeah, no, that's, they're the number one. The teachers of this country, their organized union is the #1 funder of campaigns in this country. What is that about? They have a vested interest in statism. But no one will write about this. No one will talk about this. No reporter will ask them. No teachers will stand up and say, we're not going to be in this union. I don't think, anyway. I don't know. Maybe there are some teachers unions where they have rebelliousness, but my gosh, so we got big challenges. When I first got out of college, I got hired by Caterpillar to be a lobbyist because I had been an elected official when I was a college student. I got elected. And then I worked for the governor for 2 summers before that, and then I worked for the state legislature. So by the time Caterpillar hired me, I'd been elected to office for 4 years, I had a couple degrees, worked for the governor for 2 summers, worked for the legislature. So at age 25, I was kind of an experienced advocate, if you will, of public policy. And when Caterpillar hires somebody, at least in those days, he had to work in the factory for a year, new college hire, because that's what they did. They didn't do all this word stuff, they did tractor stuff. And so they said to me, we're going to offer you the job of being a lobbyist at the state level at the time, here in Springfield, Illinois. Caterpillar's headquartered in my hometown of Peoria, Illinois. But the last guy we offered this to, he was a young guy in his 20s, but coming off of a couple of years working for the White House. He said, I'll take the job, but I'm not going to work in the factory for a year, because that was beneath him. And so they didn't hire him. I knew him because I grew up with him. And so then I wasn't in the interview process, but they looked around and they found me, or I found them. And they said, now we're going to offer you this job, but you don't mind, you have to work in the factory for a year. And I said, I love factories. Who doesn't like to visit a factory? It's fascinating. Take tours of factories. Oh, it's a wonderful place. Anyway, it was unionized, UAW, and it was problematic, that's for sure. But I said, of course I'll do that. And I was a foreman for a year. So I had 11 people working for me, and they each were operating different machines. We were machining aluminum torque converter parts, which goes into the transmission of the tractors, okay? And so they're drilling and they're cutting and they're all this, it's just shaving iron, except this was aluminum. And they were operating all these machines. And one of the problems is, the piece starts as a raw material and everybody does a different thing to it. This is typical production. And down here it becomes this impeller, stator, turbine. There's 3 different pieces to I haven't said that in a while. 3 different pieces to the hydraulic transmission of the tractor. And if one of these machines goes down, it doesn't break. I found out it goes down. I said to so the first 3 days was running pretty well, and I was keeping track, and I like a good foreman knew, because these people are all doing this. Then all of a sudden, this guy says, my drill is not working. My drill is down. I said, what do you mean it's down? He said, well, it's down. It's broken. And you have to get an electrician and a millwright, because I don't know what the problem is, but we need a couple of people. And they're UAW employees, which means you got to find them, these guys, and then you have to buy them coffee and a Snickers. You got to bribe them. No, really. You say, oh, you need me? Okay, I'll come over, but I need a coffee and a Snickers first. And they would sit there and drink their coffee and tell you about when they were fishing last weekend. It was crazy. And finally he comes and fixes it. And so at the end of the day, I said to my general foreman, John Bergelow was his name, I said, I could be a real good foreman if these machines didn't break down. To which he said, if the machines never broke down, we would not need you. And it dawned on me, I have a job as a foreman because things kept breaking. I didn't realize that. I thought I'm just supposed to keep everybody in good spirits and write down their progress, how many parts we have and what supplies we need. The big problem was, how do I manage a problem here? And every generation has their problems, right? My parents had World War II and Depression. My grandfather had World War I, etc. And so your problem is you got a completely divided society. All this socialism, Marxism, tear things down stuff, that's yours. So instead of a world war, we've got a civil war. It's the second civil war, a second American Civil War. You can read Os Guinness, who's a good friend of mine, Os Guinness, Suicide of a Free People. OS is his first name, and Guinness, like the beer, his family, his ancestors own the beer company, Guinness Beer People out of Ireland. Wonderful guy, he's a British citizen. He lives right by me in McLean, Virginia, and he writes books, a lot of books. And Suicide of a Free People is about the civil war we have going on in this country today. Any other comments or questions?
I'm not sure any thoughts on AI and machine learning, because that's the obvious sort of next step for this generation that they're going to have to grapple with.
Yeah, and artificial intelligence is what she's talking about. Yeah, once we replace arms and legs and then memory and logic, then we use those tools, especially these tools, to learn and replicate how we behave. And then pretty soon, those lessons get digitized. I'll give you an example. So a buddy of mine got very rich, George Giorosity. He was the CFO of a little startup software company 15 years ago, 20 years ago, called Remedy. And I'm sure it's probably still a company today, or maybe Google bought it or Microsoft bought it or something. But Remedy's product was the following. They made software for appliances. So washing machines, dishwashers, refrigerators, freezers, that sort of thing. Kitchen appliances. And based on, and so they would be talking to the equipment and finding out what the readings were. And then they would keep track, let's say the Viking refrigerator, okay, model A2. They would keep track of how long before things would wear out, like the compressor or the ice maker or the rubber on the doors. And they would learn that because they're connected to the appliances. And then pretty soon, they had software that would say to the Viking refrigerator company, by the way, every 7.5 years, XYZ part goes out in these. And then they call you and say, my refrigerator doesn't work, I'm unhappy, right? So what you need to do is contact your customers after 7 years with the Viking A2 refrigerator and say, by the way, you bought a warranty because it's an expensive refrigerator, and it will be up in 7.5 years, and that's when the XYZ, the compressor or whatever, should probably break down. So we'd like to come out and replace that for you now so it doesn't break. So that's artificial intelligence, if you will, learning about human experience, about mechanical experience, and then being able to predict it. And then pretty soon, the person doesn't know anything about it. The computer tells the other computer to tell the salesman that has a device in his hand, oh, go to this home and replace this, all right? So, but in everything, the Internet of Things, if you know what that is, that's all connected with artificial intelligence, which is the Internet of Things is you have all kinds of digital, like that is probably just an analog clock. It's just battery operated. But let's say that clock was connected to all the clocks in this building. Then you would have the beginnings of the Internet of Things in terms of your clocks. It's all be computerized. Very helpful. Yeah, and artificial intelligence, like every other technology, can be dangerous. It can control people, etc. Every technology has good and bad. Every knife in the drawer can help you prepare the meal or kill somebody. if you, once in a while, I thought about the fact that here I am at a banquet, and there's 500 people in the ballroom back when we used to have banquets. And every person at every table has a knife. Everybody's armed. And yet nobody's harming anybody, right? This is like when you get into the gun control discussions, I would like to say, how about knife control? Because, you know, if we have people at banquets, pretty soon, those need to be rubber knives, you know, they really can't cut anything because they're dangerous. No, it's people that govern themselves that need control. And that starts with the family, right? The first level of government, I learned, don't use the knife in a bad way, only use it to cut your cheeseburger or whatever. So, all right, any other? Yes, sir.
Can't really have a robust discussion about economics without having a discussion about monetary policy.
Yeah.
Whoever controls the money, its quantity, we see that has formed a lot of our history here. We see some interesting things happening with the dollar, quantitative easing, unlimited, where they're going to seem to print it into oblivion. How do you think that's going to affect our situation in the future?
Very good question, very timely. And now we've just spent, what, 2 or 3 extra trillion dollars we didn't have in this country on the virus. But everybody's doing this. EU just voted for $1 trillion transfer, et cetera, all this wealth that isn't created. So all of you get to inherit all the wealth, right? All the debt from wealth that hasn't been created yet. There'll be a day of reckoning. Greece has now a debt equal to 200% of their GDP. It's the highest in the world. But on average, we have about 100% of our GDP is in debt now. And Germany is 80%. Germany is healthier than we are, better managed in terms of government. But we will have a debt crisis. And part of the reason is because of the pyramid triangle. Historically, the world has old people up here and young people down here. And because people are having children and they're dying at a certain age, we can take care of the debt. But in 1900, the average life expectancy in the United States and Europe was what? 45. And along in 1921 came what? 1921, Alexander Fleming in a laboratory in England. Penicillin, okay? Until 1921, 70% of people in the world died from infections, sepsis, infections. Penicillin and antibiotics turned that into 3%. So now people are dying from cancer and from heart. Those are the big killers. Because our average life expectancy today is almost 80 years old. We've almost doubled. But people still retire at 65. Now, my father was president of a bank. He retired at 61 because his father had died, I think, at 72 of a heart attack. My mother's father had died about the same age of a heart attack, at 70. So my parents thought we're going to live to be about 70 because that's how long our parents lived. So my father retired at 61. He loved to golf. Of course, he was very busy around the bank and he loved to golf. And so he wanted to, he said, told me, I want to get 8 or 9 years of golf in before I die. That was his ambition. I've been asked by the PGA not to golf, okay? So I don't golf, but he really loved it. He golfed for 31 years. He died at 92. 31 years of golf, but also 31 years of Medicare and Social Security. When Social Security was passed in 1935, the average life expectancy was 60. And so most people never got it. But what we've done is we created a retirement system built on this pyramid. But these are the old people today, and these are you guys. You're going to college. My parents didn't. My parents had kids when you're your age, right? And my father built a house when he was your age himself. You guys get debt and your education, then maybe you get a house or get married, and then you have kids, and maybe 1 or 2, not 4, 5, 6. My mother's 1 of 10, my father's 1 of 5, right? So people are getting married later because they have debt and more education, having fewer kids because it's very expensive. Remember how expensive our government is, right? Human flourishing. But people are living longer because of health advances. So we have more and more people being supported by fewer and fewer people. And this is true in every country in the world, except for a dozen or so that have populations that are still growing. But this is in China, Japan, Russia, all across Europe, the United States, Canada. Everybody has this problem. Another talk I give is called the age of biogenetics. Will it be the last age of prosperity and freedom in the West? So it's a different talk, but it's about the fact that this is getting more and more expensive, fewer and fewer people here. And so you're inheriting a world where you're going to be supporting all these elderly people. So one of the things we have to do is we have to have retirees not totally retired. The whole mindset has been, I'm 65 or I'm 63, now I go from working 40 or 60 hours a week to golf. You know, rather than I'm going to transition to, for example, I have 2 part-time jobs. I'm 69. I have 2 part-time jobs. I'm on 2 payrolls. For the James Wilson Institute, I help manage that, and I give speeches for Save Our States. And I'm on Social Security, I'm on Medicare, et cetera, but I'm still earning a living and still producing. But most people don't do that. And so one of the things we have to do is say, let's say you're a radiologist, you read x-rays. Now, in this country, we have 1 doctor for every 350 people. In Indonesia, they have 1 doctor for every 3,400 people. We have 10 times the doctor support than they have. So why don't we take a radiologist who reads x-rays and say in the morning, you get on your computer and you read x-rays from Indonesia and have them pay you, because they just put it on your screen and you say the person has a broken rib or they have cancer or whatever the x-ray is, or CRT or scan or whatever it's going to be, medical scan. And then you can have lunch with your spouse, and then you can golf in the afternoon or golf in the morning and read x-rays. But we have to have people, instead of immediately retire, start to transition, work part-time here, for example, for a nonprofit. I work for 2 nonprofits now after 38 years working for profitable companies. Right? So one of the things we're going to have to do is say to your grandparents and your parents, you're going to have to keep producing here, because we can't have you all just on the government. Oh, we're going to go bankrupt. But we will have crashes in these societies, debt crisis. And we haven't seen anything yet. 2001, 2008, 2009, these are just warning signs. It's like, oh, I'm a little dizzy. You're dizzy before you have the stroke, right? The stroke is coming. And so we have a lot of challenges, like in that machine line, that's why you all in your education. So I asked you what you want to accomplish, what you want to do, right? When I do some career counseling for young people your age, and I have them do an exercise. Before they meet with me, they have to go through 3 Economist magazines and 2 National Review magazines. And I have them page through each one and rip out the stories they would like to read because it interests them. Nobody's assigned it. Just rip them out, staple them, etc., and bring them to me, and we sit down and we lay them out. And we say, gee, why did you pull these out? So, for example, for me, I'd pull out articles about the euro, about Brexit, about the semiconductor industry, about the Electoral College, about the Constitution. But Would I pull out any articles about ankle surgery? No, I have no interest in surgery, etc. So you know what you know, natural law. So the good Lord has already told you what you're interested in. So do you know who Johnny Carson was? You do? You all know who Johnny Carson was? He was a talk show host before David Letterman and Jay Leno and those guys. And now I don't know. Jimmy Fallon did. I don't, these guys are, they all think it's about them. The reason that people for 30 years watched Johnny Carson was because he never talked about himself. He talked about the guest. Now all these people that have talk shows, they're the show, and they use the guests to show how wonderful they are and their virtue and all this stuff. It's just so self-centered. Carson was all about the guest, forget about himself. People watched in part just to see if he would ever show us a glimpse of who he was. But how do you get in that business? He was from Lincoln, Nebraska, Johnny Carson. And when he was 9 years old, his father was an insurance agent, I think, but I have to look it up. He said to his parents, I want to learn close-up magic. I want you to pay for me to have magic lessons. Close-up magic is where the guy sits in the table with the people and he makes the quarter go through the table, right? Or he makes the dollar bill come out of your ear, or he rips up the dollar and then he pulls it out of your wallet with your signature on it and it's whole again. That's close-up magic, right? How you have the red ball go to this cup without moving the cups, and on and on and on, right? And his father said, what a waste of time. You're 9 years old and you want to just, trick people, why don't you get life? He said, no, I really want to learn close-up magic. And so he took lessons. He became the great Carsonac. That was his 9-year-old title. He was Carsonac, right? Now, fast forward 40 years, what's he doing for a living? And by the way, when you're a magician, you're using pattern. Show me your hand. No, your clean hand. You're using jokes to entertain while you're moving the quarter down here or whatever. You're using patter to keep them engaged while you're doing the magic. It's part of the deal. Patter is a big part of success in magic because you have to have misdirection. Oh, well, do you have something? While you're asking them, you're actually doing something here, but everybody's looking at him. That's what they do. So pattern is very important. So 40 years later, what is Johnny Carson doing for a living? He's sitting at a desk, entertaining and telling jokes, right? He knew at 9 years old, I want to be at a desk and I want to entertain. So you know what you want to do. You just, that's the way it is. When I was 8 years old, I'm going through all the National Geographics in my parents' library of National Geographics, and I'm taking out all the maps. They used to have there all these map supplements. And then I was putting them in a file box by continent. I don't know, I can't explain it, but this is what I was doing with my pajamas that had the feet on them. And Mr. Gaybauer and his wife came for dinner that night with Poker Club or Pinochle Club or something. And I'm in my room sorting the maps. And he said, hello, Michael, what are you doing? Oh, I'm organizing the maps. And I was 8. And he said, why are you doing that? And I said, because someday I'm going to be involved with world events and I need to know where the countries are. I've been to 67. Okay, so I knew at age 8 that I was somehow interested in knowing where the countries were. So Peter, all right, Peter, smart guy that you are, you know what you're interested in. So don't let anybody tell you, I know where there's a job opening. Find out what kind of a squirrel you are and where those squirrels hang out, right? So you're interested in the family foundation because you like these squirrels here. You like what their mission is. They're different than rabbits, different than foxes, right? So what I have them do is I do these articles and then we lay them out and we say, what are you interested in? And they may say, I'm interested in travel and history. And I say, okay, Al's interested in history, for example. Well, travel and history, you could be a teacher of history, Or you could have a travel agency that does historic trips. Or you can work for the State Department as a foreign service officer and travel the world and learn its history for the State Department. All of those are travel and history, but those are completely different careers. But what you want to get in touch with is what you want to be involved in, and then find out who does that. And then you go and see those people about jobs. That's what you want to do in your careers. I have a whole slide deck I'll send you with questions to ask yourself. Like the number one question is, where do you want to live? Do you want to have a family? Do you want to have children, etc.? Because those are key to your career. I had a young man in Washington when I was at European American Business Council. Somebody sent him my way and he wanted to talk about careers. And I said, well, the first question I have for you, he had a British passport because of his mother and an American passport. He just graduated with a master's degree at George Washington University. I said, well, first question I have, he was looking to see if he could work for the European American Business Council. First question I have is, where do you want to live in the next 5 years? Oh, well, within 5 years, I want to live in London. Why is that? Well, my mother's family there, and I really prefer it there to the States. And I said, so why are you in my office? You should be at Dulles Airport flying to London right now. And he looked at me like I'd given him permission. You think I could do that? And I said, well, they fly every day. You can pack and then go tomorrow. But you can do it. Well, thank you. And he flew to London and looked for a job there. So you want to know where you want to live, what you're interested in. The rest is easier, but you've got to solve some of those problems. All right, taking a lot of your time here, but thank you very much.